Some people don't realize this. But at some point, suffering stops being something that happens to you and quietly becomes part of who you are. Not because you want it, but because it feels familiar, because it gives meaning, because it explains your past. And the most painful loop isn't the pain itself. It's when your identity begins to orbit around it. This is where unnecessary suffering is born. Spiritual awakening doesn't remove pain. It removes confusion. And in 2026, confusion will repeat faster than ever. If you've already started to notice patterns instead of blaming yourself, this isn't about becoming better. It's about breaking the loop. Number one, when pain becomes identity. There is a moment in the awakening process that almost no one talks about. Not because it's rare, but because it's uncomfortable to admit. It's the moment you realize that suffering is no longer just something you experienced. It has quietly become something you carry, something you reference, something you use to explain yourself, and sometimes to define yourself. At first, pain is real. It happens. It hurts. It leaves marks. But over time, something subtle can occur. The mind begins to organize itself around the wound. You don't just remember what happened. You introduce yourself through it. You interpret situations through it. You anticipate the future from it. And without noticing, pain stops being a chapter and becomes the narrator. This is where unnecessary suffering begins. Not because the pain wasn't valid, but because the psyche starts mistaking familiarity for truth. What feels familiar feels safe, even when it hurts. This is why people unconsciously return to the same emotional situations, the same relational dynamics, the same inner dialogues, even after awakening, because the pain feels known, predictable, structured, and the ego prefers a familiar wound over an unfamiliar freedom. At this stage, suffering provides something deeper than discomfort. It provides identity. It answers questions like, why am I like this? Why do people treat me this way? Why does life feel heavy? The story becomes coherent. But coherence is not the same as truth. Awareness doesn't ask you to deny what you've been through. It asks you to notice when pain is being rehearsed instead of healed. There is a quiet difference between honoring your experience and orbiting around it. When pain becomes identity, growth feels threatening, because healing would mean losing the story that explains you. And that's why awakening can feel destabilizing at first, because consciousness doesn't attack the wound. It questions the role the wound has been given. In 2026, this pattern will become impossible to ignore, not because life will be harsher, but because repetition will become louder. You'll notice when you're reacting from memory instead of presence, when old narratives activate faster than your awareness, when suffering appears not as a surprise, but as something already familiar. This is the moment the spiritually awake begin to diverge from the rest, not by denying pain, but by refusing to build a self around it. Because once you see that pain is being used as identity, the loop starts to loosen, and that's when real responsibility begins. But there's a reason this loop survives even after awakening, and it often hides behind something that sounds wise, something spiritual, something we're praised for doing. Number two, when everything becomes a lesson. After awakening, many people fall into a subtle psychological defense. And this defense doesn't look like fear. It looks like wisdom. Everything becomes a lesson. Every emotional wound is reframed as growth. Every disappointment becomes a spiritual teaching. Every painful dynamic is justified as something you were meant to experience. From a psychological perspective, this is not integration. It's rationalization. The mind takes pain and wraps it in meaning, so it doesn't have to confront what the pain is actually asking for. Change. Carl Jung observed that the psyche will often choose meaning over transformation because meaning feels safer. Meaning allows the ego to stay intact. Transformation requires the ego to reorganize. When everything becomes a lesson, suffering is no longer questioned. It is explained. And this is where unnecessary suffering survives. In Jungian terms, this pattern often belongs to the spiritualized persona. The persona is the image we present to the world, and sometimes to ourselves. After awakening, this persona can shift from strong or capable to aware, evolved, or wise. But when wisdom becomes a role instead of a state, it begins to protect itself. Admitting that something is simply harmful can feel like failure. Walking away can feel like regression. Ending a dynamic can feel unspiritual. So the psyche reframes endurance as depth. From the nervous system's perspective, however, nothing has changed. The body doesn't respond to meaning. It responds to safety. If a situation continues to activate tension, hypervigilance, or exhaustion, the nervous system is not being taught. It is being overloaded. This is why many spiritually awake people feel confused. They understand the situation intellectually, but their body keeps reacting, because insight alone does not end a loop. Jung warned that insight without action only inflates consciousness. It doesn't integrate it, and inflation is dangerous. It creates the illusion of growth, while the same patterns quietly repeat. True maturity begins when awareness stops asking, "What is this teaching me?" and starts asking, "Why am I still here?" Some experiences are not lessons. They are boundaries being ignored. Some situations are not initiations. They are signals to disengage. And some forms of suffering are not transformative. They are simply unnecessary. In 2026, this will become harder to bypass, because repetition will feel heavier. The gap between insight and action will feel louder, and the psyche will no longer tolerate spiritual explanations that protect the same old loops. Wisdom is not extracting meaning from everything. Wisdom is knowing when meaning has become a disguise. And once that disguise falls away, another belief begins to collapse. The belief that something is fundamentally wrong with you, and that you must keep fixing yourself to move forward. Number 3, when you stop trying to fix yourself. At some point in awakening, a quiet exhaustion appears, not from pain itself, but from the constant effort to improve, always adjusting, always refining, always searching for the next insight, the next realization, the next version of yourself. On the surface, this looks like growth. Psychologically, it often isn't. It's the ego working overtime. In Jungian psychology, the ego is not the enemy. It's the organizing center of consciousness. But it has one major limitation. It believes something is always missing. So when awakening begins, the ego doesn't disappear. It simply changes jobs. It stops trying to become successful and starts trying to become whole. This is where the trap forms. The ego takes spiritual language and turns it into another self-correction project. You're not healed enough, not integrated enough, not conscious enough. And without noticing, the pursuit of wholeness becomes another form of self-violence. From the perspective of the self, the deeper, regulating center of the psyche, nothing needs to be fixed. The self doesn't demand improvement. It demands relationship. Relationship with what was avoided, with what was judged, with what didn't fit the persona you learned to present to the world. This is what Jung meant by integration. Not removing parts of yourself, but bringing them into awareness, without trying to correct them. Fixing seeks elimination. Integration seeks contact. And this distinction changes everything. When you're trying to fix yourself, you stay in a loop of urgency. When you begin integrating, time slows down. The nervous system settles. The psyche stops bracing, because wholeness is not achieved by force. It's recognized through presence. This is why many spiritually awake people feel tired, even when they understand so much. Understanding without integration keeps the ego busy, but leaves the self untouched. In 2026, this will become especially visible. The pace of information will increase. The pressure to evolve will intensify. And those who remain trapped in constant self-fixing will feel increasingly fragmented. Spiritually awake people begin to choose differently. They stop asking, "What do I need to change to be acceptable?" and start asking, "What part of me hasn't been welcomed yet?" That single shift ends entire loops of unnecessary suffering. Because when the psyche stops fighting itself, energy returns, and with it clarity. Number 4. When you learn the difference between intuition and nervous system fear. One of the most confusing parts of awakening is learning to trust what you feel. Many people believe intuition feels intense, urgent, loud, but psychologically and biologically, that's rarely true. Most of what people call intuition is actually the nervous system reacting to perceived threat. And the body knows the difference, long before the mind does. Fear-based signals tend to arrive with contraction, a tight chest, a shallow breath, a clenched jaw, a restless urge to act now. You feel pushed, rushed, pressured. Intuition feels different. It doesn't shout. It doesn't hurry. It arrives as clarity, often quiet, steady, and grounded. Recent research in neuroscience and psychophysiology supports this distinction. Studies on the autonomic nervous system show that when a person is regulated, especially when the ventral vagal system is active, decision-making becomes clearer, more flexible, and less reactive. In simple terms, a calm body sees better. Fear, on the other hand, activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the state associated with fight, flight, or freeze. In this state, perception narrows, memory biases toward past threat, and the brain prioritizes survival over truth. This is why fear feels convincing. It's fast, it's familiar, and it's loud. You see this in everyday life all the time. That sudden urge to send a long message explaining yourself. The impulse to say yes even when your stomach tightens. The pressure to decide immediately, just to stop the discomfort. Those are not intuitive hits. They are regulatory attempts. The body is trying to escape tension. Intuition doesn't come with that urgency. From a Jungian perspective, this distinction is essential. Jung warned that when unconscious fear drives decisions, the ego mistakes reactivity for guidance. The self does not rush. The self does not panic. It waits until the system is receptive. This is why spiritually awake people begin to pause. Instead of reacting, they learn to ask the body a different question. Not, does this feel intense? But, does this feel grounded? Modern research on interoception, the brain's ability to read internal bodily signals, shows that people with higher interoceptive awareness make more accurate emotional and relational decisions. They're better at detecting subtle signals before they escalate into anxiety or regret. In daily life, this looks very simple. You notice your shoulders relax when you think of one option, and tighten when you think of another. Your breath deepens around certain people, and shortens around others. Your body settles when you delay a decision, instead of forcing one. These are not mystical signs. They are biological intelligence. Spiritually awake people don't eliminate fear. They learn not to confuse it with truth. And as the nervous system becomes more regulated, entire loops of unnecessary suffering dissolve, because you stop building your life around reactions and start building it around coherence. Once the body becomes a reliable signal again, another shift naturally follows. You stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening in the first place. Number 5. When you stop explaining yourself to people who don't listen, One of the quiet shifts that happens after awakening is realizing how much energy is wasted on explanations. Not conversations, not dialogue, explanations, the kind that go in circles. You explain your choices at work, to colleagues who already decided what they think of you. You justify your boundaries, to relatives who see your independence as rebellion. You clarify your intentions, to people who listen only long enough to respond, not to understand. Psychologically, this pattern is rooted in a need for safety. Explaining yourself feels like protection. Like if you find the right words, the tension will disappear. But in reality, explanation often becomes another loop. Because when someone isn't listening, more clarity doesn't create understanding. It creates exhaustion. In workplace dynamics, this shows up constantly. You over-explain decisions in meetings. You soften statements to avoid discomfort. You preemptively justify yourself before anyone even questions you. The body tightens. The breath shortens. The nervous system braces. That's not communication. That's self-defense. In family dynamics, the pattern is even deeper. Relatives who comment on your life choices, your pace, your relationships, your boundaries. You explain to keep the peace. You explain to avoid guilt. You explain because silence feels like rejection. But spiritually awake people begin to notice something subtle. They notice who listens after the first sentence. They notice who stays curious, and who stays committed to their interpretation. And that awareness changes behavior. From a Jungian perspective, this shift represents a weakening of the approval-seeking persona. The persona exists to help us belong. But when it becomes overactive, it sacrifices authenticity for acceptance. Awakening doesn't eliminate the persona. It stops letting the persona run the entire system. You realize that being understood by everyone is not a requirement for integrity. And that silence, in certain situations, is not avoidance. It's discernment. This doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means choosing where your energy actually lands. Spiritually awake people begin to explain less and observe more. They speak when there is openness. They stop performing clarity for closed systems. Because not every relationship is meant to evolve with you. And not every misunderstanding needs correction. In this year, this boundary will matter even more. Work environments will move faster. Families will cling tighter to old roles. And over-explaining will quietly drain those who haven't learned when to stop. Ending unnecessary suffering sometimes looks very simple. It looks like a pause, a breath, and the decision not to continue a conversation that was never truly mutual. But once you stop explaining yourself, another pattern becomes visible. The way guilt pulls you back into dynamics you already outgrew. Number 6. When guilt pulls you back into old dynamics. Guilt doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, usually at night. It shows up when the body is tired, and the mind has nothing left to distract itself. You replay conversations in your head, things you didn't say, things you maybe shouldn't have said, moments where you wonder if you were too much or not enough. The chest tightens, the stomach feels heavy, sleep becomes shallow, interrupted. This is how guilt keeps old dynamics alive. Psychologically, guilt is often mistaken for morality, but they are not the same. Guilt is a bonding emotion. It evolved to keep us connected to the group. And when you begin to change, guilt activates as a warning signal. Not because you did something wrong, but because you stepped outside an old role. In family systems, this is especially powerful. You set a boundary. You say no. You choose distance. And suddenly your body reacts, as if you've committed a betrayal. The nervous system interprets separation as danger, so it pulls you back, through rumination, through second-guessing, through that familiar inner voice saying, Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should explain. Maybe I should just go back. This is the loop. From a Jungian perspective, guilt often arises when the ego begins to detach from an outdated persona. The persona wants continuity. The self wants coherence. And when these two clash, the psyche produces guilt to restore the old balance. But that balance was already costing you sleep. It was costing you peace. Spiritually awake people begin to notice that guilt has a physical texture. It's not abstract. It's the racing thoughts at 3 a.m., the clenched jaw in the morning, the sense of heaviness that doesn't lift, even after rest. And they stop asking, "Why do I feel guilty?" They start asking, "What am I being pulled back into?" Because guilt doesn't mean you made a mistake. It often means you broke a pattern, and patterns resist being broken. In 2026, this resistance will feel stronger. As relationships shift, as roles dissolve, the old dynamics will attempt to reassert themselves through emotional pressure. But spiritually awake people respond differently. They don't argue with guilt. They don't suppress it. They don't obey it. They observe it. They recognize guilt as a signal, not a command. And slowly the loop weakens. Because when you stop returning out of guilt, you stop feeding the very patterns that kept you awake at night. And once guilt loosens its grip, a final realization settles in. Not all suffering can be avoided, but most of it no longer needs to be repeated. Number 7. When you accept necessary pain and stop creating the rest. One of the most difficult realizations in awakening is accepting that some pain is unavoidable. Loss will happen. Change will hurt. Endings will leave marks. No amount of awareness removes that. But there is a quiet power in learning which pain is part of being human, and which pain is being created by repetition. Spiritually awake people stop trying to eliminate pain. They stop fighting reality. And in doing so, they end an enormous amount of suffering. Psychologically, unnecessary suffering is not caused by events. It's caused by resistance, by replaying what cannot be changed, by returning to what already revealed its limits, by demanding clarity from situations that have already answered you through exhaustion. Necessary pain moves. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Unnecessary suffering loops. It keeps the body tense, the mind busy, the heart braced. From a Jungian perspective, this is the difference between initiation and repetition. Initiation transforms you. Repetition drains you. And the psyche knows which one you're in. In 2026, this distinction will become clearer than ever. Life will not slow down to accommodate avoidance. Patterns will reveal themselves faster. And suffering that once felt tolerable will start to feel unbearable. Not because you're weaker, but because you're more aware. This is where responsibility replaces hope. Not the responsibility to fix everything, but the responsibility to stop feeding what no longer evolves. Spiritually awake people begin to choose presence over performance. They allow grief to move through them without narrating it endlessly. They let disappointment arrive without turning it into identity. They feel pain, and then they let it pass. This is not detachment. It's discernment, and it brings a surprising result. Energy returns. Sleep deepens. The body softens. The mind becomes quieter. Not because life became easier, but because it became honest. And this is the real meaning of breaking the loop. Pain refines. Repetition drains. And once you see the difference, unnecessary suffering no longer survives your awareness. Awakening isn't about becoming someone new. It's about stopping the repetition of what no longer belongs to you. 2026 doesn't demand perfection. It demands honesty. Honesty about the patterns you've outgrown, the dynamics you keep revisiting, and the suffering that no longer teaches. only drains. Breaking the loop isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It happens the moment you stop arguing with reality and start responding with awareness. If this spoke to you, if you felt recognized instead of judged, subscribe to Hidden Mind, because this channel isn't here to motivate you for 5 minutes. It's here to help you see what's been shaping your life from the shadows, so you can finally choose differently. And in the next video, we're going deeper into spiritual awakening, not as a trend, not as a label, but as a psychological shift that changes how you think, how you feel, and how you move through the year ahead. If you want a 2026 that's not just new, but genuinely better, calmer, clearer, and more aligned, make sure you're here for that. Until then, breathe, stay honest, and keep breaking the loop.